When you want to get to know someone or learn about something, you start by asking a question. Persona is the first platform dedicated entirely to question and answer conversations, interviews. Every day, we bring you great interviews from all over the world that will inform, entertain, and inspire you. At Persona, we think our world could use a little less telling and a little more asking. Join the conversation by downloading the Persona Interviews app today or visit personainterviews.co. Hi, everybody. I'm Rob Simmelcare. Welcome to Persona Custom Interviews. I am pleased to be joined today by one of the leading venture capital investors in America. Dan Ciporin is a general partner at Canaan Partners, a venture capital fund that has raised over $5 billion, over 11 funds in its lifetime. Dan, correct me if I got any of that wrong. And really one of the top funds, East Coast, West Coast, early stage focused, and someone I'm really looking forward to talking to about what's happening in the world of venture capital investing. Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Rob.
So when I first reached out to have this conversation with you, it was probably 2 months ago. It was in the midst of the coronavirus quarantine. And I was really wondering, as a startup founder myself and someone who spent some time in the world of venture capital, how someone like you was thinking about managing this crazy scenario we've got in 2020. Then, of course, George Floyd happened and the protests and everything that we've seen since then. So I want to touch on both of these. We'll get to the coronavirus stuff in a bit because it's still obviously extremely relevant. But first, I want to talk to you about what's happening with racial protests. And this is a very complicated issue. Of course, the heart of it is the police violence situation, which is its own thing. But it's become a broader conversation, right, about racial imbalance in our country, about opportunities across the board, across the economy when it comes to, whites, blacks, and others. What role do you, as an established investor in startups, see for the venture capital community in doing something about this issue that so many Americans have now woken up to?
Sure. So, one of the things that we do as early stage venture capitalists is we give money, invest money, I should say, into companies that are hopefully going to impact the world in some significant way, as well as do very well financially. And by doing that, we hope to give capital to places and to people that would not necessarily get it otherwise, because when you start a company, that's a very difficult thing to do. It is something that takes a lot of gumption and takes a lot of real entrepreneurial fervor to do. And you have to believe in your dream, and you have to follow through on it in circumstances that are not usually ideal. So we think about our role as finding people that do not necessarily have access to capital for the great ideas that they might have. And one of the things that I think we feel very strongly since the Black Lives Matter movement and obviously since the incident with the murder of George Floyd, is that we need to do a better job at finding people who have not traditionally had access to capital, who are pursuing their dreams, and who will make a very good, hopefully great financial return from them. And so we have been talking a lot about that. It is in many respects, it's a difficult challenge because it is difficult to find great companies, people who are looking to build their dreams and potentially have great companies. It's always a challenge to find those diamonds in the rough, so to speak. I think if we look at ourselves honestly, we tend to look in maybe more well-trod areas than we probably should be looking at. There are certainly people who have CS degrees from, elite universities that are sort of easier, if you will, to find, to track, to potentially fund than others who might not have those credentials or background, but who might have just as much, if not more, entrepreneurial skills and talent. and certainly as much passion and desire to fulfill a dream as any of those folks do. So so we need to find better ways to connect with, to understand where we can find those people who can build great companies and who we may not have traditionally come across in the ways that we normally come across entrepreneurs that are building great companies, which is, a networking process, as you know, and sometimes that networking process can leave out folks that we really ought to be looking at. So we're taking a deep look at how we can increase our ability to find those great companies and those great entrepreneurs that we wouldn't normally find.
It's certainly, not a new conversation, obviously. There's been studies done on this going back a while. There's an organization called Diversity VC, which did a study in 2019 that showed 77% of venture-backed founders were white, regardless of gender or education. Just 1% were Black. I'm proud to be among that 1%, but it's a small club. Women-founded startups, 9% of venture investments. Latino founders, 1.8% of those receiving funding. Numbers that are certainly out of step with the rest of American society. Is the conversation different now, Dan? How is it different? This is not, as I said, not a new conversation. Sure. Is there more urgency now, do you think? And what do you think that means in terms of next steps?
100%. There's absolutely more urgency. I think, tragically, what happened to George Floyd woke a lot of us up to, to a situation that's simply not acceptable in America. I think that this is a problem that is deep, and it's a problem that extends across America. 1%, you mentioned that number, and that sounds accurate to me. I think 1% of Fortune 500 CEOs are African American.
Yeah.
So this is a deep, endemic, systemic problem that as VC firms we are certainly part of, but it's a broad problem, and we all have to recognize it. I think we have at Canaan we have people of color, and we have women that are partners, general partners, and certainly part of our investment staff. And I think that if you look at traditional metrics of gender and color diversity, we rank very highly in that regard. I think we have 30+% of our general partners are female, and we have close to 50% of color, but we do not have the kind of African American representation that we absolutely need. We are simply in a situation like the rest of America where we need to do much better.
What do you think, when we first started the conversation, you talked about what venture capitalists do, right? They find companies that change the world and, of course, hopefully have financial returns. And you've got investors. You're not just an investor. You've got, partners who are invested in your fund, and they're looking for returns. So at the end of the day, how do you balance those things? And my sense, having spent some time in this field, is that it really will only truly change, Dan, when it's not just you and your partners talking about doing this, but your LPs, the people who invest in your fund, who are saying to you, listen, yeah, we want financial returns, but we need to see better metrics on the types of companies we're backing, because we've got to tell our stakeholders that we're backing a diverse set of us. Is that happening? And isn't that really, in a way, necessary if this is going to be a sustained change?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to say I think it's an absolutely false choice to say you have to choose between great returns and backing diverse entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs, whether they're women, African American, other people of color. I just think that's a completely false choice. I think that you and study. There are many studies
Yeah.
that show that diverse companies and that companies that have diversity at the top, again, whatever diversity it may be, African American, female, um, people of color, do better than companies that do not have that level of diversity. So I think this is something where, there's a confluence of interests here around getting great returns and backing companies that have more diversity at the top in particular.
It's almost a safety thing to a degree. At least it has been, Dan. Right? You feel there's somewhat of a group mentality, and humans in general, right, and investors as well feel that where you want to invest is where others want to invest. Where there's a pack, there's a safety in numbers sort of a thing that goes on, and that I think, Dan, correct me if you disagree, is part of what leads to that, looking in the same well-trod places that you talk about, the schools that tend to churn out the CEOs, the Silicon Valley sort of, let's call it cliques or areas where you tend to find these people and tend to find these types of founders. And is that part of it, is almost a sense of, well, as a VC, you're not going to get questioned too much if you invested in a certain type of founder from a certain place in a certain school?
Absolutely true. You referenced the fact that I think there are 2% African Americans in venture capital firms writ large. And think if we had 15%.
Yep.
Think of the different kinds of companies that we would come across, the different sort of deals that we could source, the different kinds of networking capabilities that we could bring to the table in terms of increasing returns, in terms of providing what we ultimately have to provide, which are great returns to LPs. But I think the very fact of being able to do that, to enhance and increase the level of African American representation and other diversity representation, is in fact absolutely critical to finding great deals and great deal sources that others don't. Because there's no question that in a field where or any human endeavor where you tend to surround yourself, or that you are surrounded by folks that are like you in many ways, you're going to tend to go down the same paths that others go down in one form or another. And so to be able to widen that scope, widen that lens, and the need is to dramatically widen that lens, I think it's essential for us across multiple different dimensions, but it's essential for us just to ensure that we continue to have great returns.
Mm-hmm. So just to close on this topic, what do you think are the concrete steps that VC firms need to take? I mean, it's, broadly speaking, yes, look harder. Do you think there are specific structural changes or other things that need to be put into place to really effectuate this concept that the investment pool needs to become more diverse and less targeted at sort of the same narrow set of founders?
Yeah, I think there's no question that you have to make structural changes. I think number one, we have to ensure we try to get more diversity into venture capital, period. And by that, I mean investors, because by getting more diversity in terms of the investor community, you're going to get more diversity in terms of the kinds of entrepreneurs that you're backing, because those investors will have different perspectives, different networks, different ways of looking at companies that are going to be critical, I think absolutely necessary to finding the kind of diversity investments that we want to have. I think you have to put resources against it. I think we're talking about a wide array of different kinds of initiatives that we'd like to look at in terms of trying to open that aperture, in addition to increasing the representation of again, African Americans in particular in the venture community. We'd like to really see if we could potentially dedicate deal sourcing resources to an entrepreneurial communities that are entrepreneurial around color, in
Hmm.
particular, and to be able to, kind of help us to access that source of deals and source of great companies much better than we have been doing in the future. So you have to, I think you have to, and certainly we feel like we have to put real resource against something like that, as opposed to simply saying, well, we need to expand our lens. We need to do that absolutely, and try and keep that in mind. But we need to really put specific resource against it to make it happen, I believe.
Yeah, that sounds right. It's I think the only thing that's going to make the difference between this being a conversation and something that leads to real results. So we'll see. I appreciate everything and look forward to seeing what happens going forward with Canaan in this regard. So let's switch topics now. Let's talk about the other cataclysmic thing that's happened in our world in the 6 short months of 2020, which is coronavirus, COVID-19, and what that has done. I'll just start, high level, Dan. How has COVID changed the world of venture investing?
Well, that's an unfolding story because the traditional mode of venture capital investing um, relies very heavily on in-person contact and relies very heavily on interaction and relationships, and that has some real downsides to it, as we were discussing just a moment ago.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that, one of the things that's been very interesting for me, at least, in the whole Zoom environment that we're now living in, is that it really does open up the fact that you can actually get to know people, build relationships with people, uh, not just from meeting them in person. That there's a lot of ability that the nature of technology today and what you can do over video is such that you can actually develop relationships. We just did a deal, for example, in the remittance space, where it was our very first 100% start to finish um, deal that we did all online. And the partner in charge of, or that was leading the point on the deal, spent multiple nights with cocktails and whiteboards, all on video, um, working with the entrepreneur, trying to think about the investment, trying to think about the company and the prospects and the opportunities, but trying to get to know and have a relationship and build a relationship with that entrepreneur as well. Because, with venture, when you invest in a company, you invest for the very long term. This is not any venture investor that thinks about some kind of invest in it and get out after a year, or as any kind of normal way to do business, should never be in venture.
Yeah.
This is more like, an investment in venture is more like a marriage. There's really a long-term relationship aspect to it that's quite significant, and for both parties, for the entrepreneur and the venture investor. And so it's important that both parties get to know each other and feel pretty comfortable with that relationship. But one of the things that we found is, we sort of assumed it was axiomatic that you could not do that except by doing things in person. And I think that one of the things that we found is, you actually can.
That's really, it's quite interesting. I hadn't thought of that angle. Of course, I agree, the traditional investment process has been very much about the in-person meeting. And it goes a little bit back, not just to the conversation about race, but also about geographical diversity of investments. And we've seen this very tight clustering of investment over the last couple of decades, right? Between the West Coast, Silicon Valley, and the East Coast, with a couple of hubs arising here and there, maybe Austin, Texas a little bit, Boston a little bit. But, venture investing has been highly concentrated in a very small handful of metropolitan areas. Do you think that this now more accepted mode of meeting and getting to know people over video could potentially change that?
100%. I
Yeah.
think it already is. I think that I heard a story the other day, not about one of my partners, but somebody at another firm who was close to doing a deal and suddenly realized, literally as they were 80% of the way through their diligence and getting close to the point where they were considering making an offer, an investment offer, a term sheet, that they suddenly realized that the founder was based in Toronto and not New York, which is what they had originally thought. And to only find that out when you're really far down the road was, I thought, at least based on the story I heard, was, I thought, very, very interesting. And you do sort of realize how much it takes you out of this framework. And you could almost think about it as a little bit blinders. I mean, again, similar to the conversation on race we were talking about, I think the geography can be at some level a blinder too, in terms of the kinds of capabilities that people in different areas bring to the table. There is this well-worn path in New York and San Francisco in particular, and maybe Boston a little bit too. But the geography, again, the geographic catalysts to being an entrepreneur are many. And I think that, this is one way that you can actually access that without thinking too much about it.
What about business models? There are certainly certain types of businesses that have been significantly impacted on the downside from coronavirus, anything related to travel or, group events, things like that, at least on the short term, have certainly been hurt. Companies like in-person co-working spaces, obviously WeWork, which was having its issues already, significantly impacted by a world where suddenly everyone is working from home. Then on the other side, you've got companies that are, at least in the short term, really benefiting potentially from this. Zoom, the platform that we're speaking on right now, and a lot of other types of businesses that are really lending themselves toward this sort of remote life. How, as an investor, do you judge the long-term impact of COVID? Because yes, we know what the short-term impact has been. We know what kinds of businesses are thriving or hurting in 2020, but not knowing how long it's going to be before there's a vaccine, or what kind of long-term behavioral changes are going to set into people's routines and the way they work and live, even after there is a vaccine. How do you account for that in investing alongside all the other stuff that you always have to think about when making an investment?
Sure. It's a very interesting question that we're asking a lot these days. And fundamentally it's, what is a COVID, not only, but COVID really primarily generated trend versus a trend that's really, here to stay. And I think that a lot of what you have to think about is, where are you seeing things accelerate that were already present before? E-commerce is a pretty classic example. Represents or represented pre-COVID about 12% of all retail sales in the United States. That's share of wallet, if you will, is going up pretty dramatically, but we're still well below what offline retail has been. And I think that the kind of realization that you can literally get, where you're in some ways forced into this horrible sociological experiment that we're all in, where everybody stays at home, and how do you now live your life given that you can't really go out and you interact via the way we're interacting now. And so as people start to experience that, they start to realize all kinds of things that, similar to what I mentioned before about Zoom and the ability to build relationships and have, you can actually do things on Zoom that you wouldn't ordinarily have thought you should or could do. Certainly the ease of buying almost anything starts to get really obvious. The whole delivery networks that have been built for almost anything on a last mile basis start to get really super convenient, and people just start to ease into that mode of operating. And I think that will continue. Anything that has had some kind of secular tailwind, I think that's accelerated by COVID. I think is going to continue to see that acceleration.
Yeah, I think it's the stuff, and you're really saying you're making the point. It's the things that people are realizing. Wow, I kind of like, I kind of like not having to hop on a plane 3 times a week to go to board meetings or business meetings. This Zoom thing, maybe it's only 80% as good as that in-person meeting, but it's 80% as good with 0% of the travel, the expense, all of that. I mean, you live in Connecticut, as do I. I can't tell you how many people, particularly, working, full-time working people, their life has changed. I mean, they have gone from commuting an hour on the train both ways, plus the extra time to get to their office, to waking up at their office, spending their time on Zoom, seeing their kids in the morning, seeing their kids in the evening, getting time to exercise. Those people are not rushing to get back to an office. And I think it's things like that you got to figure are going to really have a long-lasting impact here. And so that's going to be interesting from an investment point of view to think about what kinds of winners and losers that creates.
Yeah, no question about it. And some of our companies are talking about, almost all of our companies are talking about some kind of hybrid working relationship now, meaning lots of obvious questions come up. Do we really need this big an office space? Do we really need an office space at all? Do we need to think about how we hire differently? When you have a world where you can literally work anywhere and do your work almost as well and potentially even better than otherwise, that creates a whole different thought process around how you hire people. There are certain things you're going to always have to do in person, even as a knowledge worker. Certainly, for a worker who's in a manufacturing facility or something, that is going to require you to be close to your job, presumably, or at least some of the kinds of work that you're going to do there in those facilities will require you to be close to where you work. Or being in a restaurant, a cook at a restaurant, clearly there has to be a physical presence there. But there's an enormous number of workers in the knowledge economy, at least, that are going to be able to choose to work anywhere. And you're now going to have a very different kind of competitive environment for talent. I think that is going to come out of that. I think you're also going to have, I think I would not want to be a commercial holding a lot of commercial real estate right now. I think that's going to be a very tough area for folks to be in, clearly.
Yeah. Businesses like, WeWork and others in that related to that space, it's tough to see any sort of smooth sailing around that stuff anytime soon. Do you think, Dan, that from a culture creation point of view, it's harder in some ways for a startup to just walk away from the idea of having teams in a single place? I mean, maybe for a more established, bigger company, you might be able to get away with that. But for so many startups, it's having people collaborating. It's the team, spirit. It's the a lot of time crazy hours, all the things that go along with creating something, which, as you've said, is hard to do. Is it harder for a startup to work that way? And still come up with the kind of creativity that is needed?
I do think it is harder, for sure. Having said that, there are companies now that are starting remote. And I think if you start remote and you build your culture that way, then it's a different kind of culture, but it can work just as effectively. I think it's probably harder for companies that have traditionally been together in an office and built a culture around that, or at least that in part reflects that. And then, trying to now become fully remote, that's a more difficult proposition. But I don't think it's impossible, because at least, you know, when I was, and this was way back when I was a CEO of an internet company called shopping.com, and we had a lot of our engineering talent in Israel. We always had to bring, even with that remote talent, we made a strong point of having once a quarter meetings with everybody in the same place at the same time. There's a necessity, I think, to have that human contact and human relationship that you have to establish as part of a company, no matter what. But you can do that potentially once a quarter and get to know the people on a 1 or 2 or 3 day offsite better than than you might ordinarily via Zoom. And then once you have that relationship that you've built, or extending, I should say, physically, you can then much easier to continue to develop that relationship via video, via remote means. So I think there's lots of mechanisms that companies can use to ensure that people feel connected, and yet still allow for remote work to happen.
Well, Dan, I appreciate your taking the time. This is certainly a 6 months none of us will ever forget. I'm sure you won't forget it. Quite a time to be in your field and pretty much any field right now. So appreciate it. Would you be kind enough to take follow-up questions if folks send them from out there over the Persona platform?
Absolutely. Happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Thank you for your time. Dan Ciporin from Canaan Partners. We'll see you next time. Thanks.